With nearly 100 democracies around the world, it comes as no surprise that the way in which such countries elect their leaders can vary considerably. These rules and procedures for counting votes and determining the winners of an election are what are known as electoral systems, of which there are too many to list in this video. Even though the type of electoral system chosen by a given country may appear to be inconsequential to the average voter, it can in and of itself heavily influence which individuals and parties get elected to office in the first place. Therefore, it is of the utmost importance to understand an electoral system if one wishes to also understand the basic structure and outcomes of a country's political system as a whole. This video in particular will focus on the electoral system known as first past the post, which is often abbreviated as FPTP, and is used in a variety of countries around the world, most notably the United States, Canada, and United Kingdom. This video will first define and explain first past the post, then we will delve deeper into the variations of FPTP within the United States, and finally we will touch on the pros and cons of this system. First of all, what is first past the post exactly, and why does it have such an oddly specific name? To answer the first question, first past the post is an electoral system in which voters are able to cast their vote for one and only one candidate to fill a single position, such as a seat in a legislature, or an executive position such as governor or president. All votes are then counted, and whichever candidate has the most votes wins. As a specific example, let's say that there are two candidates in a given district who are running for a seat in their national legislature, one from the Purple Party and another from the Orange Party. In the end, the Orange Party candidate receives 52% of the vote, and the Purple Party candidate got only 48%. Very simply then, the Orange Party candidate has won because they received the most votes out of the two choices. Due to this simplicity, it is unsurprising that a fair amount of countries utilize first past the post for either some or all of their elections, including countries such as the US, Canada, India, and the United Kingdom, and a handful of others in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. However, as exemplified by certain US states, there are some variations to FPTP that one should be aware of. As illustrated by this map, while the vast majority of US states use the standard version of first past the post, states like California, Washington, Georgia, and Louisiana use a variation of the system, and even some states like Maine and Alaska, and many local governments, don't even use first past the post for their general elections at all. Starting with Georgia, which has a two-round system, a candidate must win a majority of the vote to win office, not just a plurality. If no candidate succeeds in getting over 50% of the vote in the first round of voting, a second election is held where voters can only cast their ballot for one of the top two vote getters from the first round. To illustrate this, let's suppose that there are now three candidates running for office, with one of them from the Purple, Orange, and Yellow Party, respectively. In the first round, the Purple Party candidate gets 45% of the vote, the Orange Party candidate gets 32%, and the Yellow Party candidate receives 23%. Under the normal rules of FPTP, the Purple Party candidate would be the winner since they received the most votes, even though they did not get a majority of votes. However, under a two-round system, a second election would be held between only the Purple Party candidate and the Orange Party candidate since they had the top two most votes, which ensures that only the candidate who receives a majority of the vote wins. Another variation of the FPTP system is what's called a nonpartisan primary system, which is similar to a runoff system but differs in some key ways. For instance, in California, instead of having a closed primary where one party votes for their nominee and the other votes for theirs separately, all candidates run against each other and the top two vote getters advance to the general election. For example, let's suppose that there are 6 candidates running in a nonpartisan primary, candidates A through F. Candidates A and B are both from the Purple Party, candidates C, D, and E are from the Orange Party, and candidate F is from the Yellow Party. The primary election is held, and these are the results. A and C both got the top two most votes, so they will be the only candidates to advance on to the general election. It is also important to note that under this system, it is possible for two candidates from the same party to both win the top two primary, and therefore be the only candidate someone can vote for in the general election. Additionally, even if a candidate wins over 50% of the vote in the primary, they must still face whichever candidate got second place in the general election. This is, however, not the case in the aptly named Louisiana primary, in which if a candidate does win a majority of the vote in the primary, they're declared the winner. But if no candidate reaches over 50%, there is a general election between the top two vote getters like in a nonpartisan primary system. Just as with the top two runoff system in places within Georgia, the nonpartisan and Louisiana primary systems exist to remedy some of the many issues with first past the post, with such shortcomings being the topic of a later section of this video. There are many reasons as to why a country or state would want to use first past the post, with perhaps the most important one being that it is simple and easy to understand. Indeed, as the ACE Electoral Knowledge Network explains, a valid vote requires only one mark beside the name or symbol of one candidate, and that even if the number of candidates on the ballot paper is large, the count is easy for electoral officials to conduct. An electoral system in which it is both easy for the average voter to understand and where determining the winner is straightforward is desirable, since it reduces confusion and conflict with vote counts along with reducing the chances for error when one fills out the ballot. Therefore, if simplicity and ease of use is an important factor for a country or locality in deciding which electoral system to use, first past the post is likely to be one of the better options. Another advantage of first past the post is that it allows voters to vote for an individual candidate rather than just for a certain political party as a whole. This is important since under other electoral systems, such as in closed list proportional representation, voters can only indicate which party they support, and then the party itself chooses which candidates will fill seats in the legislature. Sometimes individual candidates within a party can vary quite substantially, and thus, under first past the post, voters are able to take these variations into consideration when casting their votes. FPTP makes a lot of sense if one wants the electoral system to emphasize the individuality of candidates, even if it means that the policy positions of such candidates from the same party may actually be quite different in some instances. First past the post also allows for specific regional representation in that constituencies, such as congressional districts in the United States, are based on geographic locations instead of being one massive at-large district. This means that under a FPTP system, elected officials have a direct geographical tie to the people and communities that they are representing. This can be advantageous since different locations across the country face a very different set of issues and priorities. For instance, if a region of the country is having a specific problem, such as failing public infrastructure, their representatives can specifically lobby for assistance for that particular region while serving in the legislature. In contrast, different electoral systems that are not based on geographical representation may lead to specific communities not having their needs met, since it's possible that no representatives within the legislature are even from or familiar with the region in the first place. Finally, under first past the post, coalition governments are also much less common since one party typically gains control of a majority of seats in the legislature, meaning that they can govern to the fullest extent of their powers without having to make as many concessions to the minority parties. While this may actually be a negative for some people, myself included, it does mean that the majority party can at least theoretically accomplish their policy agenda much more completely and effectively. On the other hand, since there is a clearly defined majority party, FPTP also creates a clearly defined and typically well-organized opposition party or parties within the legislature that can more easily challenge the majority's policy proposals. Thus, while FPTP typically creates a clear majority party with a sweeping mandate and powers to carry out their will, it also creates a stronger oppositional force within the legislature compared to other electoral systems. To summarize, the advantages of using FPTP are that it is easy for voters to comprehend, members of the legislature represent specific geographic regions, voters can vote for individual candidates, there's typically a clear winning majority in government, and the opposition is usually well organized. And so it appears that we have found the most ideal and glorious electoral system known to humankind, and this series and video can end here, is what I would say, but as you can see, this video is definitely not over yet. Indeed, first past the post is personally my second least favorite electoral system. I'm looking at you, single, non-transferable vote, and has some issues, to say the least, so let's get into that. The first major disadvantage of first past the post is that it does not require that the winning candidate receive a majority of the vote. Indeed, in many cases, the winner of an election under FPTP may even receive far less than half of the total vote. This is actually quite common in countries that use first past the post around the world. For instance, as the BBC points out, quote, in most constituencies in the United Kingdom, more people in total vote against the winning candidate than for them. Sometimes an MP can be elected on a vote as low as only 35%, a minority of the vote. The winning party is also usually elected by less than 50% of the voters. In other words, FPTP can and often does lead to the minority of the population electing a majority to the legislature. This, of course, runs entirely counter to the point of having a democracy in the first place. On a similar note, FPTP can also lead to what is known as the spoiler effect, which also contributes to minority rule. Put simply, the spoiler effect occurs when 3 or more candidates are running in a given election, in which 2 or more candidates who are similar in political ideology split the votes of their base between each other, leading to the other candidate winning instead. In other words, let's say that candidates A, B, and C are running for a seat in the legislature. Candidate A is part of the Purple Party, B is a member of the Magenta Party, and C is running for the Orange Party. In this scenario, the Purple and Magenta parties are certainly not identical, but are similar enough for voters from either party to prefer them to any candidate from the Orange Party. The election is held and the results are as follows. Even though the majority of the population, 55%, prefers either candidate A or B to win, the votes are split between them enough to the point that a minority of the population is able to elect the winner instead. In part due to this spoiler effect, voters in a first-past-the-post system are also incentivized to partake in strategic voting, which is sometimes referred to as tactical voting. In simple terms, strategic voting refers to when someone casts their ballot for a candidate who is not their first preference for winning the election, but does so because they don't believe their actual first preference has a reasonable chance of winning. This is problematic because it means that the outcome of elections under first past the post are not necessarily determined by an honest and accurate recording of people's preferences of the candidates running for office. Because of this, it is common in some countries that primarily use first past the post, such as the US, to really only have 2 viable parties, therefore making it incredibly difficult for candidates from small parties to be elected at all, even if they have a sizable amount of support from the electorate. Because first-past-the-post elections only produce one winner, proportional outcomes are also rarely achieved. If FPTP had proportional or fair representation, support for a specific political party among the population should translate to that party gaining roughly the same percentage of seats in the legislature. However, this is not the case, as first-past-the-post can, and regularly does, lead to a considerable mismatch between the number of voters who support a party's agenda and how many of their candidates actually win an election. For example, let's say that a country has 5 legislative districts with 100 residents each, and each district has a candidate running from the purple, orange, and yellow parties. An election using first past the post is held, and these are the results. The Purple Party is able to win 3 districts, the Orange Party gets 2, and the Yellow Party unfortunately doesn't win a single election in any district. Overall, 221 voters cast their ballot for the Purple Party candidate, 215 for the Orange Party, and 64 for the Yellow Party. This means that with support from only 44.2% of the population, the Purple Party is able to secure a whopping 60% of the seats in the legislature and therefore ignore roughly 56% of the voting population's wishes. The Orange Party, on the other hand, gets close to fair representation with support from 43% of the population, translating to the party winning about 40% of the seats. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Yellow Party since, despite getting 12.8% of the population to support their candidates, they receive no seats in the legislature whatsoever. This demonstrates how elections using FPTP can and do result in a mismatch between voter preferences and the degree to which each party is able to gain representation in the legislature. This specific example also highlights yet another problem with first past the post, the fact that a lot of votes are wasted in elections. In this instance, wasted votes refer to votes that simply do not help any particular candidate get elected. This happens because of two different reasons, one of which being that once a candidate achieves a plurality of votes under first past the post, any votes they receive on top of that don't make any difference whatsoever. While this isn't really an issue for single-winner electoral systems, it is a significant contrast to multi-winner systems such as single transferable vote, in which excess votes are allocated to voters' next preferences. Second, votes can be wasted in that many voters may cast their votes for candidates that don't really have any chance of winning at all, and thus their vote has little to no impact on the election at all. Since voters are only able to choose one candidate, their vote in this scenario is simply wasted as it cannot be transferred to the next candidate in their order of preferences. However, this is more of a general issue with plurality than specifically first past the post itself, but it is worth mentioning since it can contribute to election outcomes being a distortion of voters' true preferences. Yet another disadvantage of first past the post is that it has been found in many countries to play a role in making it harder for ethnic and racial minorities to win elections. As a rule under FPTP, parties put up the most broadly acceptable candidate in a particular district so as to avoid alienating the majority of electors. Thus, it is rare, for example, for a black candidate to be given a majority party's nomination in a majority white district in the UK or the USA. And there is strong evidence that ethnic and racial minorities across the world are far less likely to be represented in legislatures elected by first past the post. This is also largely a result of only having a single winner district, as it incentivizes candidates to focus their time and energy on gaining support from demographics that most represent the majority of people. Of course, the whole point of a democracy is for the majority of people to make the decisions, but at the same time, it is critical for different groups to get at least some sort of representation and a seat at the table. Fortunately, first past the post often does not rise to achieve this difficult yet important goal. And so this brings us to the final main problem with first past the post. It makes gerrymandering a lot easier. Like other geographically based electoral systems, FPTP relies on the creation of districts for legislative seats, which must be drawn by some political body, and said political body typically has a vested interest in drawing the boundaries in a way that helps its incumbent members stay in office. Of course, independent commissions can be created to draw such boundaries, but it's impossible to remove bias entirely. Since FPTP requires only one winner per legislative district, such districts tend to be fairly small, which makes it even easier to manipulate them. While geographic representation is important, the way in which FPTP is designed makes it far more likely for the boundaries themselves to be abused, leading to rather undemocratic outcomes. In the end, the main takeaway from all of this is that electoral systems are far more complicated than one might think, and all have their benefits and drawbacks, and as this video has explored, first past the post has many of both. The advantages of FPTP are that it allows for specific regional representation, voters can vote for an individual candidate, a single clear winner is determined, the opposition parties are more organized, and is relatively simple for voters to understand. On the other hand, first past the post doesn't guarantee a majority winner or proportional outcomes, encourages strategic voting, can lead to the spoiler effect, makes it difficult for smaller parties and racial minorities to win, and makes it easier to gerrymander legislative districts. Regardless of what you think of it, it is important to understand first past the post as it is widely used across the world, and fortunately or unfortunately, it is likely here to stay for quite some time. Thank you very much for watching this second part of a hopefully long-lasting series of videos I plan to create on various different electoral systems. Apologies to my almost 24 subscribers for the long delay. This video took about a year and a half longer than I expected it to, but a lot of life things have happened since starting this project. So if you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, cast your vote by hitting that like button and let me know down in the comments below what your favorite electoral system is.